In the spring of 2019, a team of 18 soldiers from the Indian Army's Mountaineering Division embarked upon a 2-month expedition to conquer Mount Makalu, the 5th highest peak in the world. Having set out from the capital city of Delhi nearly a month earlier, they paused at a waypoint known as Mount Makalu in order to acclimatize to the thinning air before pressing on toward the Makalu base camp. It was there, close to their encampment, that they stumbled upon something wholly unexpected, an encounter that would chill them far more than the freezing winds ever could. The Makalu expedition of 2019, mounted by the Indian Army's mountaineering team, commenced on the 27th of March and formed part of a long-standing tradition. Similar ventures had been carried out for decades before, each serving as a commemorative gesture toward the victories won during India's 2 to 100-year struggle against British rule. Though the colonial yoke eventually came to an end, the sudden partition that followed unleashed vast migrations, fierce contests for power, and decades of bloodshed. The ever-present threat of foreign terrorism and violence within India's own borders has kept its army on constant alert. For this reason, the mountaineering divisions of the Indian Army are trained with extraordinary rigor, prepared not only for the challenges of combat but also for the demands of high-altitude warfare. Beyond sharpening martial skills, each successful expedition instills esprit de corps, nurtures courage, and carries forward the traditions of the armed forces into the next generation. The spring expedition of 2019 was led by Major Manoj Joshi and comprised 4 officers, 2 junior commissioned officers, and 11 other ranks. On the 2nd of April, after reaching the Himalayan foothills, the team began its trek toward the Makalu base camp. A week later, on the 9th of April, as they traversed a narrow valley within the Makalu Barun National Park, they paused at an elevation of 4,500 meters at a place called Mount Makalu, where they might allow their bodies to adapt to the thinning air. While encamped there, several members set out to reconnoiter the surrounding ground and made a discovery that left them utterly astonished. A trail of massive footprints pressed deep into the snow not far from their tents. Using their available mountaineering equipment to measure them, they determined that the largest print stretched to 81 centimeters in length and 38 in width, more than 3 times the size of an average man's foot. What unsettled them even further was the manner in which the tracks appeared, arranged in a linear fashion, as though made by a creature capable of walking upright. Each stride measured nearly 1.2 meters, whereas the average human step was little more than half that distance. The Indian soldiers realized at once that whatever had left such marks must have been of immense proportions. It was the first time an Indian Army expedition had encountered such a multitude of prints, though perhaps it was not entirely unexpected. For 2 centuries, strange discoveries of this very kind, attributed to a mysterious being called the Yeti, had been reported by explorers and soldiers alike. Skeptics have long maintained that such tracks could only have been left by Himalayan brown or black bears. Attempts to collect samples of hair and hide in the region believed by some to be remnants of the Yeti have only deepened the doubt, for nearly all, if not everyone, of those samples has ultimately been identified as belonging to local bears or goats. Yet bears of the Himalayas move upon 4 legs, and their spoor bears little resemblance to the prints documented by the Army's mountaineering team. At least a portion of the soldiers believed that what they had seen belonged to something else entirely. These were men well acquainted with the signs of local wildlife, including bears. In comparison, a bear's track is easily recognized, marked by the pad of a bare foot and the distinct impressions of its claws. Whether or not those Indian soldiers truly placed their faith in the ancient legend of the Yeti, the fact remained that finding enormous footprints of an unknown creature pressed into the snow so near to their camp was hardly a comforting experience. Despite the skepticism of modern times, there was once an era when the Western world was captivated by stories of the Yeti, so much so that the United States Department of State issued formal guidance on the matter to its embassy in New Delhi. A dispatch dated the 30th of November 1959 set out 3 regulations. First, any expedition undertaken in search of the Yeti required the payment of a royalty of 5,000 rupees to His Majesty's Government of Nepal for the issuance of a permit. Second, should the Yeti be encountered, it might be photographed or captured alive, but under no circumstances was it to be killed or fired upon except in the case of self-defense. All photographs, and indeed the creature itself, if taken dead or alive, were to be surrendered to the Government of Nepal at the earliest opportunity. Third, All reports or news casting light upon the creature's actual existence were to be submitted directly to the government of Nepal and withheld from the press or the public without official sanction. Fast forward to 2019. Hoping their discovery would be treated with seriousness, the Indian Army posted the evidence upon its official Twitter account, seeking to stir public interest and perhaps prompt a thorough scientific inquiry into the strange tracks. As might be expected, much of the world's media responded with mockery and disbelief. But could there not be some kernel of truth behind the legend? From the moment the first Europeans set foot in Tibet and the greater Himalayan ranges, the local people spoke to them of a towering, mysterious creature. The earliest written reference dates back to 1832, when B.H. Hodgson, the British resident at the court of Nepal, recorded that native hunters had fled in terror after encountering a wild man covered from head to toe in dark hair. More than half a century later, in 1889, Major Lawrence Waddell of the Indian Army, a Scottish explorer and surgeon, encountered enormous tracks in the snow while climbing at an altitude of 17,000 feet near Sikkim. His local guides assured him that the prints were those of a creature called the Yeti, one fierce enough to attack human beings and even carry them away for food. They further explained that the best means of escape was to flee downhill, for the Yeti's long hair would fall forward over its eyes as it descended, blinding it temporarily and allowing a man the chance to get away. In truth, the legend of this creature is by no means confined to the frontier between India and Nepal, where the Army's mountaineering team encountered the tracks in 2019. Tales of the Yeti are found across nearly every mountain range of Asia. Reports of its appearance stretch from the Caucasus in the far west of the continent to the Himalayas in the south. From the Pamir Range lying just north of Afghanistan and Central Asia, all the way to the easternmost reaches of Russia more than 7,200 kilometers to the northeast. In other words, the widespread skepticism of the Western world holds little meaning for the people who dwell in these regions. Those who live amid Asia's mountains pay no mind to the doubts of outsiders who have never set foot in their lands, yet presume to dismiss their testimony. Nor are they alone in such beliefs. For the modern world is filled with stories of similar beings, the so-called rock apes of Southeast Asia, the Mapinguari of South America, and the Sasquatch or Bigfoot of North America. Legends of the Yeti may well date back centuries, even millennia, before Europeans ever came to these mountains, carried down through generations by word of mouth. To those living in Western society, however, the tale of the Yeti is scarcely more than a century old. The legend of the abominable snowman first entered the mainstream in 1921, when members of the British Everest reconnaissance expedition reported sightings of such a creature. The team, led by Colonel Howard Berry, was engaged in the earliest attempt to scale the northern face of Everest when they discovered a series of unusual tracks. The colonel suggested they were likely those of an unusually large gray wolf. Yet, when the party was but 7 kilometers from the north face of Everest, crossing the Lakpa La Pass at an elevation of 6,850 meters, they were startled to see a number of large, dark figures moving in the distance, shadows etched starkly against the swirling snowstorm. The Tibetan porters with them insisted without hesitation that the shapes could not be wolves, but were clearly beings known as Yetis. In 1925, Nikolaus Tambazi, a Greek photographer attached to a British geological expedition, claimed he too had glimpsed a Yeti while trekking along the Zimu Glacier, the largest glacier in the eastern Himalaya of India. He swore he had come close to capturing its image. Called urgently from his tent by the porters, he saw a dark, upright figure several hundred meters away, seemingly unclothed, moving from one rhododendron bush to another, and at times uprooting them altogether. The strange being remained in sight for about a minute before vanishing into dense scrub. Burdened by the cumbersome photographic equipment of the day, Tambazi was unable to ready his lens before the apparition disappeared. A decade later, in 1937, the celebrated mountaineer Frank Smith, one of the most distinguished climbers of the interwar years, ventured into the remote wilderness of Tibet. There, he too came upon a series of strange footprints pressed into the snow, each stride measuring at least 60 centimeters, equal to the full pace of a grown man. But what kind of person, possessing feet of such colossal size, would walk barefoot through snow? Following the trail, Smythe was astonished at the course it described. The creature had crossed ravines and icy gullies with the agility of an expert climber. His notes and photographs were later examined by the Zoological Society and the Natural History Museum, only to be dismissed with the conclusion that the tracks belonged to some unidentified species of bear. Smythe accepted this ruling, and indeed, The photographs he had taken did bear some resemblance to the spoor of a quadruped. That same year, amid clashes with Japanese forces, a Russian reconnaissance unit operating in Mongolia reportedly saw two figures descending a hill. When the shadowy forms failed to respond to a challenge to identify themselves, Russian sentries opened fire. The next morning, upon inspecting the bodies, the unit was shocked to discover beings resembling ape-like men, of human stature and covered entirely with long red hair. Regrettably, owing to the war, the remains could not be transported to Moscow for proper study. Such tales and rumors continued to circulate throughout Asia's mountain ranges in the pages of black and white print, always accompanied by enough uncertainty to allow scholars to dismiss them as fabrications. Yet not every photograph of peculiar Himalayan tracks could be so easily explained away as the mark of a bear. In the years following the Second World War, Western media interest in the Yeti flared once more, this time sparked by the testimony of a man of considerable standing. He was a leading member of a scientific expedition, with no motive to embellish, and his account proved especially startling for two reasons. First, it was corroborated by his fellow team members, including a respected surgeon. Second, the photographs he produced were so bizarre that they defied all easy dismissal. 6 years after the end of the Second World War, and having completed his military service in Hungary, Eric Shipton had long since returned to the passion of his youth mountain exploration. In the early winter of 1951, while crossing the Menlung Glacier just north of Tibet's southern frontier with Nepal, he and his party came upon a footprint so extraordinary it defied belief. Puzzled, Shipton and the expedition's surgeon, Michael Ward, photographed the tracks. One measured some 18 inches in length and just under 13 inches across, its shape altogether peculiar, 4 broad toes, and a gigantic, almost circular big toe. From his own observations, Shipton was convinced these impressions had been made by a bipedal creature, not by any quadruped such as wolf or bear. Shipton reasoned that the only animal with a vaguely similar foot might be the orangutan, though its toes were far longer, and the species did not inhabit Tibet. His local Sherpa companion, Tenzing Norgay, was adamant that the prints belonged to the Yeti, a creature capable, he insisted, of leaping across crevasses and using its toes to grip the far side securely. Tenzing went further, recounting that he had seen a Yeti himself 2 years earlier, at a distance of but 25 yards, a half-man, half-beast figure, clothed in reddish-brown hair save for its face. From that encounter, Tenzing had come to believe that the animal feared humans more than humans feared it. When the expedition returned to Britain, Shipton's strange photographs began to circulate widely, and to many they could mean only one thing: proof that the legendary Yeti truly roamed the Himalayas. Yet the Natural History Department of the British Museum quickly rejected the evidence. Leading experts there insisted that the tracks must have been left by a langur monkey native to the Himalayas. Critics countered immediately, pointing out that langurs moved chiefly upon 4 legs, and that their long, narrow feet bore no resemblance to the rounded 4 or 5 toes shown in Shipton's photographs. A more imaginative interpretation came from the Dutch zoologist Bernard Heuvelmans, who in 1952, 1 year after Shipton's discovery, published a series of articles in Paris. He reminded readers that in 1934, a German paleontologist and geologist named Ralph von Koenigswald had purchased several ancient teeth from a Chinese apothecary in Hong Kong. At the time, powdered teeth were valued as medicine. Among them was a massive molar, human in form but twice the size of an adult gorilla's, suggesting that its owner had once stood nearly 12 feet tall. Further evidence dated the giant to nearly 500,000 years ago. Though assumed to be long extinct, the creature dubbed Gigantopithecus was eerily similar to many eyewitness descriptions of the Yeti, so much so that sketches of the fossil giant made decades later seem to echo those earlier tales. 2 years afterward, in 1954, the Daily Mail mounted an expedition of its own, intent upon capturing one of the elusive beings alive, or at the very least photographing it. After 15 weeks trudging through Himalayan snows, they found no snowman. Instead, they discovered something else. Yeti scalps, several of them. These objects were long, conical in shape, covered in coarse hair with a stiff ridge running down the center. A number of Tibetan monasteries kept such relics, holding them sacred. Yet scientific investigation would later reveal that at least one of these scalps had been stitched together from fragments of animal hide. Another was taken under scrutiny by the legendary New Zealand mountaineer, Sir Edmund Hillary, a veteran explorer Hillary himself had once encountered supposed Yeti evidence, tufts of coarse black hair discovered at an elevation of 19,000 feet during his climb in 1951. Superstitious Sherpas, terrified of the omen, had snatched the hair from him and flung it over a nearby cliff before he could preserve it. At last, in the hope of securing a genuine sample of Yeti hide and hair, Sir Edmund Hillary pledged to the monastery that its sacred relic would suffer no harm, then dispatched it to Bernard Heuvelmans in France for analysis. Sadly, this scalp too proved false, though not through deliberate deceit. It had been fashioned from the skin of a Himalayan siro, a mountain goat antelope native to the very snowy ranges where the Yeti was said to dwell. The hide had been stretched and steamed into a conical shape, quite possibly once serving as a ceremonial headdress. Its form recalled what some believed to be the elongated skull of the Yeti, but in truth, the shaping had been carried out many years earlier, and over time the monastery's knowledge of the relic's origins and purpose had simply been forgotten. Because it was ancient and revered, many came to believe it must be the scalp of the Yeti. These scalps thus became yet another unfortunate example of mistaken identity, a gift to skeptics eager to dismiss the Yeti as mere legend. Yet such a conclusion may well have been premature, for even if explorers seldom laid eyes upon the creatures themselves, throughout the remainder of the 1950s expeditions from Britain, Europe, Russia, and even America continued to record extraordinary tracks in the high snows. Among them was a French cleric, Abbé Pierre Bourdet, who during his 1955 expedition traced 3 separate lines of strange footprints. Soon after came Major Lester Davies, a former Royal Air Force pilot who had flown combat missions against the Japanese in Malaya. In the post-war years, he had become an accomplished mountaineer and head of a mountain rescue team. Like his colleagues, he photographed enormous, unidentifiable tracks. This same era also saw the involvement of Tom Slick, a Texas oilman turned adventurer. In 1957, fascinated by the growing collection of reports, he financed and personally led a celebrated reconnaissance. His team interviewed numerous eyewitnesses, uncovered odd tracks, and collected hair thought to be from the Yeti, though like so many others, they never achieved direct contact with the beast itself. In this first journey, Slick was injured and thus engaged 2 brothers, Peter and Brian Byrne, to continue the search later that year. It was Peter who uncovered further relics said to be linked to the Yeti, yet another scalp, and most tantalizing of all, a skeletal hand preserved at the Pangboche Monastery in Nepal. The next chapter of the tale is shrouded in contradiction. Some early accounts allege that Peter Byrne had removed a thumb and a finger bone from the hand without the monk's permission. Later recollections, however, tell a gentler story that Byrne negotiated with the monastery and obtained the relics in exchange for a substantial donation toward its repair. Either way, the bones were ultimately spirited out of Nepal and carried into India. The next challenge was how to smuggle those fragments through British customs and back to the United Kingdom. Among those Byrne could turn to were the American actor Jimmy Stewart and his wife, Gloria. Aware of the expedition and happening to cross paths with Byrne while traveling in Calcutta, they agreed to help. The bones were hidden in Gloria's undergarments to ensure they would pass inspection unnoticed. Yet, as with the so-called Yeti scalps before them, disappointment soon followed. Authenticating the Pangboche Hand and the other relics gathered by Slick's team proved fraught with difficulty. Unlike the scalps later shown to be fashioned from the hide of mountain goats, these bones, when examined in Britain during the 1950s and again decades later by the American television program Unsolved Mysteries, yielded no clear conclusion regarding their origin. It was not until the year 2011 that a BBC documentary arranged for one of the finger bones to be retested at the Edinburgh Zoo in Scotland. The result was unequivocal. It was human. Some suggested that the monks may have pieced together human bones to create what appeared to be a Yeti hand. Tragically, the relic itself was stolen from the monastery not long after Unsolved Mysteries aired in 1991, preventing any further tests on the remaining fragments. Thus, the Pangboche Hand became yet another reason for skeptics to dismiss the Yeti as myth. Wounded during his first journey, Tom Slick nonetheless financed 2 further Yeti expeditions, though he did not personally accompany them. In the end, the 1957 venture produced little more than 3 sets of human-like tracks, a handful of scat samples, a few tufts of hair, and the bones and hide thought to belong to the Yeti. Even with 3 blue-tick hounds, a breed renowned for its tracking skill, the following year's return brought only an unverified tale from 2 Sherpa porters, who claimed they had encountered a timid Yeti. By the time of his third journey into Nepal in 1959, no firmer evidence had been gathered than in the 2 attempts before. The Texan adventurer, weary of the expense and disappointment, abandoned his private sponsorship of Yeti hunts. Yet in the years that followed, explorers who had never set out with the creature in mind sometimes proved more fortunate. In June of 1970, while climbing Annapurna in northern Nepal, the mountaineer Don Willens witnessed 2 flocks of crows suddenly erupt into panicked flight. The Sherpas accompanying him remarked, with unnerving calm, that it was likely the Yeti which had startled them. With nightfall approaching, Willens did not pursue the matter further, but at dawn the following morning he discovered a line of deep footprints, each the size of his own boot. The trail descended the mountainside to an elevation of some 13,000 feet, then vanished abruptly upon a ridge 15,000 feet high. Willens dismissed the possibility that the marks had been left by a bear. The following night, under the moonlight, he glimpsed a dark figure moving across the slope. He described it as an ape-like being, bounding swiftly uphill upon all fours. For decades after Willens's strange encounter on Annapurna in 1970, reports of the Yeti continued to emerge not from trained scientists so much as from the fraternity of mountaineers. In 1974, a particularly chilling story was recorded in the village of Makurmo, high in Nepal's Khumbu region at roughly 15,000 feet. A Sherpa woman claimed she had been attacked by a Yeti. She insisted that the creature had burst into her hut at night, killed several yaks, and struck her unconscious with a single heavy blow. Villagers who rushed to her aid reported finding unfamiliar tracks in the snow about the dwelling. Skeptics suggested a bear, but the Sherpas themselves were unshaken in their conviction that the assailant had been a Yeti. By the late 1970s, strange and oversized tracks were again being photographed by climbers upon Everest and neighboring peaks. In 1978, Reinhold Messner, one of the greatest mountaineers of all time, and the first to summit Everest without supplemental oxygen, reported a personal sighting. Crossing a lonely Himalayan valley at dusk, he claimed to have seen a towering figure, upright upon 2 legs, human in its bearing yet cloaked in black hair. It fled before he could study it closely, but the vision left such a lasting impression that Messner devoted years afterward to the Yeti, ultimately publishing a book in which he argued that the creature might in truth be a rare species of Tibetan bear, capable of walking bipedally for short stretches. With the dawn of the 1980s, the Yeti had become not only an emblem of Himalayan folklore but also a powerful figure in Western popular culture. Expeditions from Japan, Britain, and the United States announced fresh plans to pursue it. In 1983, a British television crew, filming in the Himalayas, reported discovering unusual tracks. In 1986, a team of Norwegian climbers photographed prints upon the snowy slopes of Shishapangma in Tibet. Another turning point came in 1991, when the surviving fragments of the Pangboche Hand smuggled relics of decades before were re-examined in the United States. NBC's Unsolved Mysteries subjected the bones to testing but could not confirm their origin. Shortly thereafter, the original hand vanished entirely from the monastery, believed stolen, and with it vanished any further chance of verification. By the close of the century, the advent of DNA analysis began at last to yield firmer answers. Many samples of supposed Yeti hair, Yeti scalps, and other monastery relics were tested, and most proved without doubt to belong to known animals: the Tibetan blue bear, the Himalayan siro, or the brown bear of the high ranges. Even as the 21st century dawned, the Yeti remained an enduring fascination. In 2013, a research team led by the British geneticist Brian Sykes analyzed DNA taken from numerous samples said to belong to the creature. Some, remarkably, matched an ancient lineage of polar bear, suggesting that misidentified bears might explain at least part of the reported encounters. Yet others argued that such a conclusion could not possibly account for the wealth of consistent testimony describing an ape-like being, upright on 2 legs, roaming the snowfields of the high Himalayas. Skeptics maintained that the findings were unconvincing, pointing to possible contamination or errors in decoding ancient DNA. Even so, the study underscored a vital truth: that even in the most remote corners of the Earth, biological mysteries still remain unresolved. Meanwhile, Sherpa tradition has never wavered. For those who live in the shadow of Everest, the Yeti is no legend to be unraveled by science, but a living presence. Monasteries still safeguard relics believed to be its scalps or bones. Elders continue to pass down stories of encounters from generations past. Today, the Yeti occupies a singular place at the crossroads of folklore, science, and cultural identity. For some, it stands as a symbol of humanity's undying thirst for discovery, a reminder that even in the age of satellites and smartphones, uncharted realms still exist. For others, it is nothing more than a familiar animal, mistaken in the moment and inflated into myth by fear and imagination. Whether the Yeti is ultimately revealed as a rare species of bear, a misunderstood remnant of prehistory, or something that lies altogether beyond the grasp of current science, its tale will remain one of the enduring enigmas of the natural world. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Farewell for now, and until we meet again.